Welcome back. 3 Palestinian men have been killed in a raid on a hospital in the West Bank city of Jenin. Now, they've been buried already. Israeli commandos disguised as medical workers and Muslim women burst into the facility and killed what they said were militants. It's claimed that the trio were planning an attack inspired by the Hamas-led assault on southern Israel in early October last year. That's when around 1,100 people were killed and over 200 taken hostage. Reprisal attacks by the Israeli army have killed more than 26,000 Palestinians in Gaza. The Palestinian Health Ministry has confirmed the deaths today, urging the United Nations to guarantee protection for those who are in centers where health care is supposed to be provided. Well, CNN has today released footage, it says, shows Palestinian men detained by the Israeli army in Gaza and brought across the border to Israel. They are shown blindfolded and barefoot with their hands bound behind their backs. The Israeli Defense Force says that the men are suspected of involvement in terrorist activity. Let's talk about this now with Human Rights Watch Israel-Palestine Director Omar Shakir. Omar, very good evening to you. Welcome back to News at Prime. So everyone is talking about this footage. These men shown blindfolded with their hands bound barefoot. Does the accusation that they were involved in acts of terrorism excuse the way in which they are shown in this picture?
Absolutely not. I mean, there is no justification ever for mistreatment and torture of detainees. There are very limited circumstances in which it could be justified to, keep people stripped for prolonged periods of time. There obviously could be a security justification for a short-term search, but to parade people around that way creates many legal questions. Human Rights Watch has, with previous images like this have surfaced, have called them to actually be a form of a very serious legal violation, an outrage upon personal dignity, which is a very serious violation of international law. So this photo would also raise similar questions should they have been published directly by the Israeli government.
Violation of international law, is that tantamount to a war crime in this instance? Is it a clear war crime, what we've seen in this video?
Yeah, I mean, outrages on personal dignity, humiliating and degrading treatment, with publication when it's done in that kind of way, certainly are serious violations of the laws of war, and depending on the particular circumstances, an intent, could constitute a war crime. Israel
will say, as it said, around some of the other reports of its alleged mistreatment of people within the Gaza Strip and surrounding areas, that these are people who have perpetrated horrific acts against Israelis and tourists on October 7th, etc., and therefore should be treated in this way. Explain to our audience the rights that a person, even when you're accused of terrorism, would have under international law, and even up to when they do go to a trial, if it gets there.
Absolutely. Look, I mean, international law has an entire framework that governs detention, and it governs detention not only of those who are arrested without reasonable or justifiable basis, but even those who are detained when there is a basis to believe they may have been involved in criminal activity. There's a basic prohibition against mistreatment, torture. People must have their dignity preserved regardless of what the allegations are, even if there is a justification for their arrest. And when it comes to charges, again, if we're talking about civilians, there must be access to an attorney. They must have communication with their family. They must be charged within a reasonable period of time. There are very strong prerogatives. And even when somebody is not a civilian, when they're being arrested pursuant to an armed conflict, there are duties and obligations on the parties, including with regards to treatment, including with regards to access to humanitarian organizations, communication, etc., that must be provided. And Israel has a long track record of mistreating and torturing detainees and arbitrary arrest.
And Israel says when it spoke to the Israeli army about this, it was told that the men were being taken to what's been described as a heated bus, but the channel says it could not find any evidence that that is actually what was going to happen, or if indeed it did happen.
Look, we can't comment on those specific allegations. What I can say is that the Israeli government, we've been documenting detention-related abuses for not years, but decades, not only with vis-a-vis what's happening in Gaza, but what's happening mostly in the West Bank, where the Israeli army obviously is, every day detaining Palestinians, where they're holding them without trial or charge in prolonged administrative detention. There are more Palestinians being held in administrative detention in the West Bank than in more than 30 years. Those include human rights lawyers, defenders, journalists, political activists. We've seen this taking place for a long time, and many are mistreated and tortured. And there are very serious allegations also regarding disappearances and tortures from Gaza in recent months.
And the Reuters news agency has reported that an Israeli intelligence dossier that prompted the halting of funding to UNRWA, the refugee agency, in Gaza and broader Palestinian territories, says that just under 20 members of staff employed by UNRWA were involved in some form of terrorist activity, i.e. the attacks on October 7th. We know that the list of countries that are withdrawing aid or suspending aid to UNRWA is growing. Is that response proportionate?
No. States should continue funding to UNRWA. Look, these are serious allegations, but UNRWA has said they are investigating them, and that's really important. And in the meantime, UNRWA provides vital services to Palestinians in Gaza. They are the primary provider of humanitarian assistance, of shelter to displaced population, to water and food. To cut off funding to them when Palestinians are facing starvation shows a callous disregard for the looming risk of famine. It is worth noting that many of the states cutting funding to UNRWA, swiftly suspending funding, have failed to suspend arms and military assistance to the Israeli government despite strong mounting evidence of war crimes and other serious abuses in Gaza.
And just on the Reuters article, we know that just under 20 people have already been fired by UNRWA as a result of their alleged involvement in the Hamas attacks on October 7th. Reuters was saying in a 6-page dossier that it's seen the Israeli government alleges that some 190 UNRWA staff, including teachers, have doubled as Hamas or Islamic Jihad militants. It says then that they have the names and pictures of 11 of them. Does that dent the credibility of UNRWA as an organization at all and the work that it does in the Palestinian territories?
Look, we're talking about serious allegations, but allegations against a small minority. There are 13,000 UNRWA employees in Gaza, 30,000 employees around the world. UNRWA has said it is investigating, it has terminated the employment of those for which they have identified as being involved. In October 7th as they investigate those claims. The reality here is you have to look at the institutional response, and states have praised that response. And funding, it's understandable that they're, waiting to see the results of that investigation, but they should continue funding. We should also understand that there has been a years-long effort, politicized effort to undermine UNRWA, and Israeli government and its supporters are seizing these serious allegations to further that campaign. UNRWA was created to provide services for Palestinian refugees until their right to return to their homes in Israel, what became Israel, is recognized. 70% of Gaza's population are refugees who were expelled or forced to flee their homes in what's now Israel. So UNRWA does vital work. Other humanitarians have said they cannot fill the gap of UNRWA. These investigations are being investigated. In the meantime, funding should continue.
And do you share the optimism, Omar, as Human Rights Watch, that was expressed by the Qatari foreign minister in an interview in the United States yesterday? Qatar has been part of meetings in Europe this past weekend in Paris aimed at securing the release of the Israeli hostages taken into Gaza on October 7th and bringing about a ceasefire. Some reports before the meeting had suggested that the time frame for that would be up to a 2-month-long pause in the fighting. Are you given any hope that we are at a point where that is even possible, probable at this stage?
Look, I mean, there have been so many different reports. It's difficult to know what's accurate. It's disappointing that we treat human beings as bargaining chips, that humanitarian aid to Palestinians or the release of hostages is linked to these sorts of negotiations. We're talking about war crimes that need to end today. Ultimately, we're coming upon 4 months. People in Gaza are facing a humanitarian catastrophe unprecedented in the modern history of Israel-Palestine. We need unlawful attacks to end, ceasefire or not. Ceasefire or not, humanitarian aid needs to go in. It's certainly, hopeful that there is some discussions happening, but this needs to end not today, not tomorrow, but yesterday, because lives hang in the balance.
Good to speak to you, Omar Shakir with Human Rights Watch. Thank you for your time tonight.